Welcome, everyone. I am so excited to be here today with one of my favorite poets, James Cruz, who's joined us to really talk about a lot of different skills that we need on this journey of breaking bias, from kindness and generosity to gratitude, gratefulness, and thoughtfulness. So we'll get into all of that. And you're in for a real treat, let me tell you. But before that, let me just introduce James. James Cruz is the editor of several best-selling anthologies, including The Path to Kindness, Poems of Connection and Joy, and How to Love the World, Poems of Gratitude and Hope, which has over 100,000 copies in print. He's been featured in the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, the New York Times Magazine, the New Republic, and on NPR's Morning Edition. He's the author of 4 prize-winning books of poetry, and a book of short essays as well, Kindness Will Save the World, Stories of Compassion and Connection. He speaks and leads workshops on kindness, mindfulness, and writing for self-compassion. And he lives with his husband on 40 rocky acres in the woods of southern Vermont. So welcome, James. It is such a treat to have you here.
Thank you, Anu. It's great to be here.
One of the things that I'm always curious about, when I read anyone's bios, including when people read my bio, I just get so self-conscious. I'm like, wow, like there are all these like things about what we've done in the world. But yeah, I'd love to invite you to just share a little bit about who you be, like who is James Cruz in his own words.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. I was thinking actually, just as you were saying that, about what Jon Kabat-Zinn says, that we are human beings, not human doings. And yet we go around talking about all the things we've done, all the things we're going to do, and have task lists everywhere. So I appreciate the invitation to just say who I am. And I guess if I were to say who I am today, I am one who wakes up very early, makes a cup of coffee, writes for several hours. I always love to read something really inspiring. Rumi, Mary Oliver, Mark Nepo, these are some of my favorites. Naomi Shihab Nye, who I know will also be a part of the summit. And I find that this sacred time before I pick up any sort of device or read any news or even talk to my husband is really healing for me. And it helps me to start the day. I mean, I am a very highly sensitive person, and so I can only take in so much. And I find that if I take in too much before I've kind of had my say and started writing and getting in touch with the soul time, then it's really harder to access that throughout the day. So that's a lot of my focus when I'm at home, when I'm not off doing workshops and readings and things like that. I really just love carrying that routine forward, and then the rest of the day can unfold as it needs to. There's business to tend to, there's snow tires to take off the cars and weeds to pull in the garden, and all that stuff, bills to pay.
Yeah. No, I really love that idea of soul time, giving yourself that respite, or it's not even a respite, it's really space in the beginning of your day to connect with one's higher self. One thing I was wanted to know really is, why did you say yes to be a part of the summit? Why is breaking bias important to you?
Well, it seems to me that it's really rooted in empathy and kindness, and these are the qualities that I've really been exploring in my work and in my life. My work really serves the work that I need to do in my life. So, I think people, because I'm I present as very gentle, soft-spoken, like, oh, you must be so kind all the time and you must never get angry. And it's like, oh no, I'm sorry. That's just not true.
I'm human.
I am also human. Talk to my husband. He will tell you I have a lot of failings. And so I need to work on all of this, just as we all do, on an individual basis and on a real collective basis. And so for me, the way you all were describing the idea of breaking bias, and I'm excited to read your book too, it's really about working on individual small group levels, daily life, it seems, and then allowing that to just ripple out into the greater sphere of humanity. And I think that if we can heal ourselves individually, then, we're going to heal some of these larger divides that we see in our society. But it's really by starting with the small stuff, the people that we can't forgive or that we want to turn away from, or the things that we're ashamed of, So I just find that I said yes to this, I think, because I want to explore it more. And it felt like a bit of a challenge too.
Yeah, no, that's so beautiful. And, some of the things you've shared, the forgiveness in particular, or empathy, kindness, these are skills, right? What scientists are calling pro-social behaviors. So it's part of the PRISM toolkit that I offer in the book. And, for me, I've shared this with you earlier, that whenever I feel a little amped up, right, or like there's a pressure building over the course of the day, and I feel the steam coming out of my ears and kind of somatically feeling tense, I'm like, oh, I need to land on some words. So, Rumi, you mentioned Naomi Shihab Nye, and your poems have been some of those words, right? So I'd love to first invite you to kind of start us off with some words, whatever comes to you, and then.
Yeah, well, I love how things work out, if you just allow them to unfold, because you asked me about why did I say yes? And one of the first poems that I had pulled up is a poem called Say Yes.
Oh, I love that.
So this one is going to be in my new book that's coming out this fall, which is called Unlocking the Heart. And it's really, it is about saying yes to small pleasures, small annoyances, maybe larger griefs, more difficult things. I feel like when I sit down to write, it's a real practice in saying yes to whatever shows up. So this little poem comes out of that. Say yes. Say yes to suede sandals you slip on to step outside. Yes to sun on your arms, even the pink welt of a mosquito bite rising up to greet you. Say yes to this clump of wild geraniums growing in perpetual shade behind the house, through a rip in the forgotten blue tarp. Say yes to tiny pink flowers winking in the dark you move deeper into, so that you may receive their promise. Yes, they say, you too can find ways to thrive, even in those places where the light seems scarce.
It's so profound. Thank you for those words and this powerful 3-letter word, yes. And I'd love to invite you to share what inspired this poem for you.
Well, I was wandering the yard, as you might guess from the poem. And I will say too that this poem was written during a period of deep grief. In 2022, I lost both of my grandmothers and my mother. And I was really raised by women. I've kind of realized this in looking back, and they were the 3 mothers who basically raised me, because my father died when I was very young. I was 20 years old. And so they mothered me for those 2 decades and really for all my life. And so I was trying to, even though I don't mention this in the poem, I was trying to say yes to that larger grief and however it was choosing to show up, while also saying yes to the pleasure of being alive, that I was still alive and able to feel the sun on my arms, step out in sandals, and be able to walk and appreciate these little people call them weeds. I think wild geraniums are really lovely.
They're wild.
Right. Yeah. And so just to appreciate this thing that was growing in the shade, in spite of just against all the odds, and to know that, okay, there's a message here that I can grow too, that I may not always have all the elements I need, but I can keep growing. I can keep trying.
It's certainly something we share, because I too was raised mostly by women. My grandmother, my mother, I have two sisters. So that feminine energy was and remains quite, surrounds me in my life. And it's made me appreciate a lot more about the rhythms of the earth and our Mother Earth, right? So as you were, speaking to the little elements of nature, little, large, supernatural elements of nature, I was reminded of this poem by Thich Nhat Hanh, where he talks about, his mother passing and how grief-struck he was. And then eventually he came to this realization that, the clouds above, the sunlight, the trees, they were all manifestations of his mother, because, just as we come, we go, and we kind of mix in with the earth. So it was like a beautiful thought of just like how transient our life is. And yet saying yes, for me, like when it comes to this idea of breaking bias, and also this idea of bias itself, the way I define it is learned habits that distort how we perceive, reason, remember, and make decisions, whether it's because of skin color or sexuality or gender identity or political views, right? Across the board. But part of, my journey into this is this idea of acceptance, saying yes, that this exists, saying yes, that, it's painful, and saying yes, that it hurts, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like that's kind of where, I'd love for you to comment on that, because I feel like in that mix, saying yes is the beginning of kindness, empathy, gratitude, and all the pro-social, emotions and behaviors kind of stem from.
Yeah. I see saying yes as really just an openness. It suggests to me that you're not closed off to what is happening, who someone is, what they might believe, what they might be saying right now. It seems like a lot of times now, maybe because we live in these silos or these bubbles where we're surrounded by people who believe the same things, that we don't have as much contact with people who believe differently or who might see things differently. And then we think like, well, they just don't exist for me. I just can't have anything to do with them. Yeah. And yet, I live in a really small village here in Vermont, and, we sort of have to see each other. Like if we're walking on the road, my husband and I love to take walks. We have to say yes to each other constantly. And, we have this one neighbor who, of course, had these signs out during the political season. And I know he believes certain things that I just think are so confusing and strange. And yet, it was, my husband was running for town council, and he was running too. They weren't running against each other, but we were all standing together outside of the polling place. And we just started talking and getting to know each other. And now every time we pass by him, he stops and talks to us. Yes. Even though we believe completely different things, we would probably vote completely differently. There's like a baseline of respect because we said yes enough to like, okay, we're standing next to each other. Maybe we could actually get to know each other and dig a little deeper. Yeah. And so it's just, and it's all those little ways, like, he stops in his truck on the road and we stop to talk to him and ask him about his family. And so there are so many beautiful ways that I think we can invite that, that kinship into our lives and remember that we are all deeply connected in ways that are so easy to forget now because we kind of exist in more disembodied ways. We're not shaking the hand of someone that we disagree with or standing next to them.
Yeah, I want to pick up there a little bit because, some people might be listening and they'd be aghast, like, well, how did you do that? Right? Because, what was the inner work that you had to come to not want this other person to be other than who they are?
Right. Well, I think a lot of that training has come through very good therapy and working with
Real talk.
working with my relationship with my husband, because I think if you're in an intimate relationship with a partner, if you're trying to really heal into a relationship with family members, you have to let people be who they are and accept who they are. You have to say yes to who they are.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're living in denial and you're never going to be satisfied because you're waiting for them to change, or you're trying to, in ways that you think are very subtle, you're trying to change them as well.
Yeah.
And so I think it was just a lot of practice. But also sometimes I think we have this view of, if you're living in a city or a larger place, like there's less at stake to treat someone poorly because you may not see them again. You're a lot less likely to see them again. In my situation here, I could see our neighbor at the grocery store.
Right.
We could need help. We could be stranded on the road in a snowstorm and need help. Or, there are just all these possibilities. And so there's almost like I don't want to say selfish motivation, but there is a motivation to actually show up and say yes to connection, because the other person might need you and you might need them at some point in the future. And I think that it could be really helpful if we walked around with that view, that in ways that I may not be able to guess or understand, I may need you in the future and you may need me. Or, and I wrote a lot about this in my book of essays that you mentioned, Kindness Will Save the World, that we don't know how a small encounter with someone is going to change our lives.
Yes.
Or will save our personal world. So I think just staying open to the possibility of someone else allows you to just accept them for who they are. However you may see that. And it takes a lot for me, because people do things that I disagree with constantly.
Yeah. No, I think that's so beautiful. And, it reminded me of this, your interactions with your neighbor are really expressions of curiosity, right? Oftentimes in instances when we learn something about someone, something about their views or their background, suddenly these associations come up. And those associations become the entirety of who that person is. And that's where things start to follow along, because that person is more than the totality of what we think they are, right? And I think that's where this element of curiosity, what I call individuation, really dissociating them from these group-based associations, really help us begin to foster that relationship.
Yeah.
And I feel like for me, like as I'm listening to you, kindness is really the balm. And oftentimes that kindness really begins with ourself. Would you agree? I mean, I know that you teach around self-love, so I'd love for you to, oftentimes, I go around the world and in every city, someone somewhere has been wearing a t-shirt saying, be kind. It's more of like an instruction, right? It's an order, be kind. Right. And it's hard. So my partner and I, we did this experiment where we actually purchased t-shirts and printed them saying, may I be kind, as a way to have people read, may I be kind, which is a reminder to them. But so many people actually stopped as strangers. It's like, you are kind, or be kind, right? Like they didn't understand what we wrote. And they asked us to add a question mark or change the punctuation. So anyway, lots of thoughts around kindness, but would love for you to share the dearth of or the presence of kindness within self.
Yeah. Well, I really love that story about the t-shirts, because I heard it in two different ways. May I be kind, sort of a wish for oneself. May I be kind to myself, to other people. But then it's like, may I be kind to you? Like kind of, asking that question, asking for freedom. And I think, it's probably good that people were really confused by that, or that they didn't entirely understand that. I would like one of those t-shirts, by the way. But I'd love to advertise that. But I do think it really all starts with being kind to ourselves and allowing ourselves to be who we are, how we are. We were just talking about allowing other people to be as they are. But we don't always allow ourselves to be who we are either, or how we are. I have felt that a lot with grief over the past few years, that, it comes up and then comes the shame or the desire to hide it, or thinking like, I'm teaching, I shouldn't be, crying in front of my students or something. And in reality, every time that I've really owned it and allowed it to be present, it has given permission to other people to just be who they are and be where they are. And that's true of joy as well. I don't want to just focus on grief. It's true of joy when I've just allowed myself to be joyful and enthusiastic. It's very contagious. Other people take that as permission. So I think that probably in the work that we both do, we meet a lot of people who are wanting to do good in the world and are activists, and yet maybe feeling really burned out, or just confused, or really locked in despair. And I think that has a lot to do with not turning that same goodness and that same care for the world onto ourselves.
Yes.
So I really think it has to be balanced somehow, that we allow ourselves to embrace self-care and self-compassion in the same way that we are giving our own goodness, we're giving our own energy and attention to the world as well.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to, learn more about your journey to self-compassion, as a queer person, a queer man, lives in rural Vermont. Like, already people are like, wait, how can he be talking about this with the state of the world right now?
Right. Yeah.
So how did you come to that? It seems like it was really a habit you had to develop, part of your soul time in the morning.
Yeah. And it took a while actually to embrace that, because I think people might be feeling like, how can we possibly talk about joy or self-care when there's so many terrible things happening in the world? And I actually think that's when we need it the most, and it does come down to kindness and love that we're needing. And I think it's really hard to project kindness and love out into the world if we're not giving that to ourselves. So it's been a journey for me to just accept, like, well, there are certain things that I need to be a kinder and more loving person. I need that soul time in the morning, and perhaps even sometimes various points throughout the day. Like if I'm activated or anxious, sitting on the meditation cushion can seem like the most indulgent thing in the world. But even just 5 minutes, settles. Like you were saying with reading a poem. Like sometimes I just need to sit down and read something by someone I love and really settle. But it's been really hard. And I think when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, I really realized that I was bad at self-care. I was bad at self-compassion, because I had two parents who were very ill and for much of my adult life. And so I was always giving to them. I have worked as a teacher for a long time. A writing coach, things like that. And so there was always so much giving. And then I realized that I needed to start giving to myself if I was going to stay well, and if I was going to stay out of anxiety. And I think it's been helpful to live in a community where one is forced to be so visible, because I spent a lot of time hiding who I was, or being fearful about being out in the world. And you might think like, oh, Vermont is so progressive, it's so easy. It's not always the case. We have our pockets of people who, think certain things and do not agree that, LGBTQ plus people deserve a voice and, should be so visible that my husband and I should be walking arm in arm or kissing out in public. That still exists here. So it's not that easy, but I think that when we allow ourselves to be visible, then we kind of make an agreement that we're just going to show up as fully as we can, even when the heat of discomfort is around us. And I think that can manifest even when we're trying to be kind to ourselves, because we say like, oh, that's so cheesy. That makes me uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Like I have this poem called Self-Compassion that starts with,
I love that poem.
Do you know that poem? Yeah. It starts with a meditation teacher calling himself honey. And the first time I heard that, I was like, that is the most ridiculous thing in the world.
I remember that. I thought of Pascal Leclerc I don't know if it was him or someone else, but it was really funny.
Yeah, but we have to move past that. And I think, I heard someone say, I wish I could remember who it was, but if you can't be cheesy, you can't be free.
Yes.
You have to be willing to be a little cheesy and a little uncomfortable in order to practice some of these habits and skills that we're talking about.
One thing that, I think for me, one thing that I'm acknowledging and noticing is that for you and also for me, like part of our existence is breaking bias, right? Just by accepting and being who we are, walking arm in arm or hand in hand with our partners who are of the same sex, right? Gives people the opportunity to shift what a man is supposed to be, who a man is supposed to love, which is quite powerful, right? As a way of being. And then those shoulds come in that interfere in our ability to be our authentic self and to love who we are. And in those moments, I find kindness is where kindness for self really helps kind of tie the knots. And one question that I've been really curious to ask you and other folks that talk about kindness is, what does kindness feel like?
Well, I have a poem.
Please, can you read it? I'd love to hear it.
Because I was going to say that to me, the first word that came to mind was warmth. And so I'll read this poem that kind of goes into it a little bit, and then we can talk more about it. So also in the new book that's coming out this fall, it's called Orbit. Go where it's warm is perhaps the best advice we can offer each other in times of distress. A pair of arms held out in the hospital room, or mugs of mint tea taken together at the table of mourning. You feel it as a force field, an orbit you slip into as soon as you meet someone new, and sense that small, blazing star pulsing in their chest, drawing you closer until you know you'll be circling that source of light and heat for the rest of your life.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's I felt the power of that warmth in my own body, often trickling as little tears in my eye, my tear duct, my eyes. Yeah, and I feel that one thing that's come up for me as I'm listening is even our language is so clear about this, when someone is cold-hearted versus warm-hearted. So like intuitively, even as humans, when we constructed language, we knew, what temperature to associate with kindness, with warmth. And why do you think it's difficult for people to cultivate this? I mean, perhaps from your own life experiences.
Yeah. Well, I think the culture kind of trains us away from the warmth and the softness and the gentleness, because these are not seen as strong qualities, We're often trained away from vulnerability, although luckily that's really starting to change, I think. We're seeing that as more of a strength. But it's hard because it's like you're talking about in your work. It's really breaking learned habits, and that just takes work. It takes really daily work, and it is uncomfortable sometimes to sit in silence with someone at a table where they're mourning or they're in grief, just drinking tea together. We want to say something. We want to fix people. We want to fix ourselves. And we're not always allowing ourselves to just be broken and to be brokenhearted by what happens in our lives, what happens in the world. I mean, it doesn't mean that we don't do anything about that, but I think we have to kind of pause and be with the pain and loneliness almost of what we're feeling, even knowing we're connected to everyone else. There's a loneliness in feeling brokenhearted or being in despair about what's happening in the world, or, yet another war going on. So it's really hard, but I think, one story that came to mind, also, I tell this in my book of essays, and this is one of my favorite stories ever about kindness. I had taken my mother to the dentist because, she couldn't afford to do it on her own, and so I was like, okay, we have to do this. I'm gonna pay for it. We're gonna go.
Don't worry.
Don't worry. But of course she did. And so we were there. She was there for a long time, like getting all these checkups, getting all this work done, and then the office manager presented us with this list of all the things that she was going to have to be done, have to have done afterwards. And all the costs. And I'm just seeing all the dollar signs. Like, I'm a generous person, but it's like, this is a lot of money. And so I was like, are you sure all this is necessary? I was in kind of a bad mood. I hadn't eaten lunch, and so I wasn't treating her very mindfully or kindly. And I just, she was kind of pushing it against because she could sense my aggression. She's like, well, no, all these things have to be done, and, yada, yada. And so I'm like, well, we may have to go somewhere else then. And we kind of just walk out. And then I take my mother home and we eat lunch, which helped.
Yes.
But I was feeling that sense of like, okay, I was really cold. And that's not who I am. That's not who I want to be in this world. And so I said, Mom, I have to go back. I'm sorry. Like, I cannot leave it like this. And so I went back to the dentist's office, sat in the waiting room. She kind of had me wait for a while because I said, I would like to talk to you. And right away, I just apologized. I said, I'm sorry I treated you that way. That is not how I want to treat people. She started crying. I started crying. She's like, I've never had someone treat me like this, like just come back and say such kind things. And I'm crying even just now thinking about it. I didn't do it for this reason.
Yeah.
But by the time I got home, my mother said she had called and all these costs were taken off the bill. So like, there were all these reductions. And I just thought, that is what kindness does. And that's what happens. I wish I could say I do that 100% of the time, but I don't, but that is what happens when we say, okay, I just need to stand in my values and I need to do the work and the really uncomfortable thing.
It's so beautiful. I've had similar experiences too. And what really I loved about this was, oftentimes we feel like we want to apologize, we want to ask for forgiveness, but we don't take that step, as humans, because ultimately there is this consciousness within us, this soul, whatever you want to call it, that is aware of what's skillful, what's not skillful, what's wholesome, what's not wholesome. And we know when we've made those mistakes like you had. And it's interesting in your story, like you couldn't be kind, but I was like, oh, wait, you were hungry. And I do this all the time. So I am so guilty of this. Basically haven't eaten or haven't slept enough or I'm thirsty. So there's a way that I'm not kind to myself.
Yes.
I've ignored and neglected my own needs, the needs of this body, right? At least. Maybe not my mind and my ego, but certainly my body. And hence,
Right.
it then affects others, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's so beautiful the way you shared the story. And I want to ask you, how did your heart feel after that experience?
Oh, just light, free, full, you know, they're warm, that word that we were talking about before, but really the freedom, you know, of just this thing that I did that wasn't, you know, the worst thing in the world.
Yeah, right.
But it just, like you were saying, whatever is inside of us that is the witness, that is aware, whether we call it a spirit, soul, whatever, is taking account of how we treat other people. And if we cause pain, if we cause suffering, and I don't want to cause pain or suffering, if I can prevent it, and if I can make it right, you know, I want to do that. I think you're right that we don't often take that next step of asking for forgiveness and really receiving that, that we don't always do that. And when we do, that freedom is waiting, because then the thing that we did or the thing that we believed about another person, it's gone. It's shifted. Even if it's not gone, it has shifted at least. And we're freer as a result.
And what you're describing is really the process of reconciliation and repair, right? Within and without simultaneously. And these ideas are just so lofty sometimes for people. I'm like, it's so simple, right? Starting with acceptance that, oh, I caused harm. Oh, I don't feel good about it. I need to do something. I need to take action, which is what you did in that moment. And yeah, thank you for sharing that. It's quite beautiful. And how did your mom respond when that happened?
Well, she was excited to tell me that actually, you know, I don't think she knew that I was going back to the dentist's office, because I was still not sure that I was going to do it, you know, that I was going to step up and actually do it. So she was excited to tell me about this. And then I got home and I said, well, I'm not surprised, you know, because I stopped by and we had this really beautiful interaction. So, you know, that's great that there's been a reduction in all the costs, but this is maybe part of the reason that happened. So she was really happy. She was thrilled. I mean, she always worried about money. And so, you know, that was one way that she felt like, oh, you know, I can take a little break. But it's sort of, I always think that there's what Buddhists call mudita, you know, the sympathetic joy. And I think it works with kindness too. Like there's this sympathetic kindness when someone has been kind or tells us a story about kindness visited on them or given to someone else, that we sort of feel like, oh yeah, that's who I am. That's who I want to be. And it sort of gives us that same permission I was talking about earlier to access the kindness, or think about like, okay, the next time I feel like that, maybe I'll step up and do the same thing, and realize that I think, you know, we have to tune into our own pain first. Like not only that I caused someone else harm, but that's actually harming me. Right. And I don't, you know, that's another self-care, self-kindness piece. You know, I don't want that inside of me. And so how can I repair and reconcile?
Yeah. You know, because all of our minds and hearts are connected. You know, we're interdependent. We're inter-are, right? As Thich Nhat Hanh says. And when we cause harm to others, we're actually ultimately causing harm to ourselves, because that witness behind knows that ultimately we're all part of the same thing, right? We are one. And the biggest illusion that I find, and this is why I wrote, one of the reasons why I wrote the book, is that there's like an us and them, but ultimately there is no them, right? Because even you know, when wars are won, and you know, certain powers claim that they are the winners, but ultimately they're the losers, because and there are no winners, because they've lost the battle of the heart. Right?
Yeah, and we all lose, right? Because there is only us, and so you can try to decimate a whole people or a whole country, and there's still us, you know. that you can't really do that. And I think you're absolutely right. We've lost the battle of the heart when we try to do that. And I feel like that urge to cause harm, to prove a point, or to seem stronger, more powerful, is just in small ways and large ways in the world, is so rooted in unhealed pain and that failure of kindness to self.
Exactly. You know, what in the Buddhist cosmology known as the three defilements of greed, hatred, and delusion. And in my book, I talk about it as a 𝐕𝐢𝐝𝐞, which is an Algonquin term for the same thing, this hungry ghost that just wants to take, not knowing why, not knowing where he or she or they are going with taking. And the antidote ultimately is loving kindness, compassion, right? To feeling the pain of even those defilements. Like, where is that fear? What is it afraid of in those moments? Well, this has been such a treat. I'd love to learn more about your book, your upcoming book, and what inspired you to bring this work into the world.
Well, I think it's very similar to what inspired you, you know, in our own ways. So the way I see the world is really through the lens of writing and poetry. And so this new book is called Unlocking the Heart. It's writing for mindfulness, courage, and self-compassion. And it really is a way into kind of tapping into these skills that we're talking about in ourselves, and doing that through writing, because I write my own poems with the hope that they will open doors for other people, that they will open the heart, and I really invite people to enter their own experience. And so the book is poems, short reflections, and then writing prompts, or even just invitations to reflect on some piece of your own experience that's brought up by the poem or the essay that I write to go along with it. And the book is kind of divided into sections. So my vision was that if people were feeling the need for self-compassion, they could go to the section on self-compassion. If they were feeling a need for healing through grief, they could go to that section. So it really is about some of this deeper stuff and saying yes to whatever shows up in the reader and then on the page as well.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's beautiful. Would you read us one more poem?
Absolutely. Yeah. This one, actually, I was just thinking about it as we were talking about pain and sort of staying with it. And so this one is based on 𝐚𝐭𝐡, which the poem kind of explains. I think a lot of us know what that is now. So it's called 𝐚𝐭𝐡 Again. In the Japanese art of mending ceramics with powdered gold, no one ever talks about how they'd leave the pots, cups, and cracked bowls broken for a while, sometimes whole generations. And so I say to you, let your heart stay shattered in its chest. Let it ache. Some might claim you've now been broken open and can let in the light. This might be true, but before you rush to gloss over the wounds, filling the holes with gold so they glimmer, try to find beauty in the broken places too, proof of where the fire left its marks on you.
Beautiful. How beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. Do you have any closing words for us? Any calls to action for our lovely listeners and viewers?
You know, the phrase that comes to mind is just stay open. Stay open to what arises in you. Stay open to that feeling of warmth or that whisper that comes when you're interacting with someone that says, ask them this, say this, you know, look deeper into this, because I think it is those whispers and those little nudges that we so often speed past. Those are the things that allow us to connect most deeply with ourselves and other people.
Yeah, it's so true. And for me, as I reflect on the opportunity that's given to us by staying open, is really building new friendships, new connections, and ultimately what Dr. King talked about, building a beloved community. Because by staying open, we're making the qualitative and quantitative changes in our own hearts and minds, which help us better embody who we are, but also enable and invite others to do the same.
That's right. Beautifully said.
Thank you so much, James. I'm so thrilled that we got to speak today and hear some of your words of wisdom.
Yeah, it's been my pleasure. It's so easy to talk to you, Anu, and I feel calmer. I feel better. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anu.